Hello and welcome to the Apologetics 315 podcast with your hosts Brian Auten and Chad Gross. Join us for conversations and interviews on the topics of apologetics, evangelism, and the Christian worldview.
I have seen things that'll turn you white.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. Greetings, Chad. It's Brian here from the Apologetics 315 podcast, and as always, joined by Chad Gross. What's new in your world, Chad?
Oh, nothing much, man. I am looking forward to today's interview. It's definitely a topic that my wife has had extensive experience in. You have had extensive experience in, but I have only heard about it and read about it. And so I am looking forward to definitely learning and asking some questions.
Yeah. For those who might not be familiar with the topic we're covering today, we're talking about the New Apostolic Reformation. Sometimes it could be known as NAR, N-A-R for short. So maybe in the course of this interview, we'll be saying N-A-R or NAR. That's what we're talking about. If you want to know a little bit more about my experience in past churches that have been sort of in this NAR movement, you can check out episode 063 of the podcast. I'll link in the show notes. But I basically tell about, what I went through and experienced in that sort of environment.
What is that? It's a plane. What's it doing here?
I think it's a mail plane.
So I did get some email feedback from that previous podcast where I talked about the New Apostolic Reformation. And I won't mention anybody's names, and I'll only read one email. But this woman says, hi, just wanted to thank you for your podcast on NAR. My family and I were a part of this movement, and it was very stressful, very traumatic, and hurtful. But I'm so grateful for God bringing us through such a time. Our discernment is sharper, and although we still have areas of healing, we have learned and grown so much since leaving. It's incredible how many have been through the same exact lies and hurts and stress as us. Thank you again for talking about it, and I will read the books you've listed. So thank you for that couple who sent me that email. And then I did get another one where a woman was talking about growing up in these sort of environments and how traumatic that was and how she left out of that church. It was very stressful for her as well. And she kind of expressed her experience like some things being so ingrained in her head that she thinks they're scripture, even if they're not. And she's still processing a lot. And she's trying to put her past behind her and learn discernment from a biblical perspective. And she's just so still hurt from that experience. And, Chad, as I was thinking about that, one of the reasons we want to look at this, it's not apologetics like, hey, is Christianity true? In the sense of how I see this topic, I see it as like, we see in culture so many people who are atheists. Maybe they've come out of churches just that were clearly not operating in a biblical way. Maybe they were coming out of what we might just loosely call kind of craziness, or people could be completely turned off to Christianity and say, of course I'm an atheist. If that's what Christianity is, I'm seeing on the TV, or these people running around calling themselves prophets and what they're saying is clearly not coming to pass, and all of the rest of the things that we've discussed and will discuss today, maybe that's worth looking at from an apologetics perspective, that we need to address what's going on that's aberrant at minimal, at least aberrant, if not completely unbiblical and hurtful and harmful to the body of Christ, maybe leading people astray, but also basically presenting a picture to the world that they are not wanting to have anything to do with.
Yeah, I think that a few things, I should say, that have come to mind as I have been listening to my wife, of course, over the years, and then, of course, listening to your experience and then reading about this in preparation for the interview, is that if this is what I would have been introduced to when I was looking into the questions of does God exist and what is true and things like that, I'm quite sure I wouldn't have become a Christian. This would have freaked me out. It would have scared me away. And it would have basically confirmed a lot of preconceived notions that I already had. But thankfully, I was introduced to a Christianity that was authentic and that encouraged good, sound thinking and seeking of God. And so I am blessed that way. The other thing I was thinking too, and I've mentioned this to you, not during the podcast, but It would be interesting to know when you look at apologetics nowadays, so much of the emphasis is on atheism. And I know that for me personally, I find atheism very interesting. I love reading arguments for and against the existence of God. And I've just always found that debate probably the most fascinating. However, it does make me pause and wonder, should we be giving more focus? We being apologists as a whole, should we be giving more focus to things like the New Apostolic Reformation and, things that are cult-like, if you will? Because I think that you're right, that there could be a very good argument made that this is destroying people's faith or even their desire to look into it and drawing them away. And I wonder how many non-believers the NAR movement has created.
Yeah. If I had not been exposed to apologetics after getting out of that, would I have just said, well, God exists, but I don't know what's true? Or, would I've landed upright? Now, of course, God's providence is over all of that. God has me in his hands, and I believe that. But from a purely human perspective, I just wonder what would my impressions be? Because I had no trust in leaders, and I was saying to myself, how can I even trust the Bible? Right. So we have two guests today. We're going to be talking to them about the New Apostolic Reformation. So what is it? If you haven't listened to those previous episodes or know what it is, you're about to find out. A number of churches today promote novel teachings and practices that don't have the support of Scripture, and many of these churches are led by so-called apostles and prophets of what is commonly referred to as the New Apostolic Reformation. We'll call it NAR, and there are a lot of prominent churches today that are of this vein, and their teachings and practices have divided families, split churches, stunted the spiritual growth of believers, and left countless Christians disillusioned by promises of healing and miraculous power that haven't panned out. They've also damaged the church's witness to a watching world. So the purpose of this interview is to help inform and warn people about a dangerous movement that has made inroads into thousands of churches across the United States and around the world. A bit about our guests today. First, Professor Doug Geivett. He's been on the podcast before. Professor Doug Geivett is professor of philosophy at Talbot School of Theology. He's got a lot of interests ranging from philosophy of religion, philosophical theology, epistemology, history of modern philosophy. He's author of a whole swath of books, which I will list in the show notes. There are too many to name. He's also the former president of the Evangelical Philosophical Society. I love Doug Geivett. He's amazing. Second, Holly Pivec. She's got her master's degree in Christian apologetics from Biola and was the university editor at Biola for nearly a decade. And she served as managing editor of the award-winning Biola magazine. So they're both co-authors of the two books about the NAR, A New Apostolic Reformation, A Biblical Response to a Worldwide Movement, which is the deeper book. And then the more accessible book, I'd say, would be God's Super Apostles, Encountering the Worldwide Prophets and Apostles Movement. I know that was a mouthful. Sorry, Chad, didn't let you talk there. But we got two guests, so it takes twice as long.
Nobody wants to hear me talk anyway. It's fine.
All right. Well, I'm looking forward to this one. Let's go to the interview.
Let's get ready. Switch me on.
Holly Pivec and Doug Geivett. Welcome to the podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having us on.
Thank you, Brian. It's great to be with you again.
Well, we've it's been quite a while, maybe 10 years or so, but I'm really happy to have you back. Chad and I both read the books that you've written about the New Apostolic Reformation. And on a couple podcasts ago, I shared a bit of my journey. It was just meant to be a book preview. Hey, we're getting ready to interview these authors. And it took up the whole thing because I didn't realize just how much stuff that I had been pushing back, and it brought it all to my mind. And I was like, oh, this is definitely something the church needs brought to the fore and given attention to. First, I'll start with you, Holly. Tell me a bit about how you got interested in this movement. What we're referring to is the New Apostolic Reformation, and then we'll go from there.
Right. And, we share these stories in our books, but when I was working at Biola University as the managing editor of Biola magazine and the university editor there for about a decade, I did my undergrad there, and I was also working on a master's degree in apologetics simultaneously while I was the managing editor of the magazine there. And a reader of the magazine sent an email. I would receive correspondence from readers, and it was a Biola graduate, And she was sent an email to the magazine, and she was talking about this movement that had overtaken churches in her city, she said, and she was very concerned about it. It was a movement she described of apostles and prophets. She was kind of hoping by contacting the magazine, I think, that I could forward the email maybe to a faculty member at Biola, someone who might consider writing a book in response to this movement and what she saw as these dangerous teachings taking over churches in her city. And so it really caught my attention at the time because I had been writing articles for the Christian Research Journal at that time. I was studying apologetics. I'd always been interested in cults and off-key groups, and I had never heard of this movement she described. And that kind of surprised me because I thought I was pretty familiar with most, movements and groups and cults and off-key groups and this kind of thing. And so I started doing some research on Google, and I quickly found that this was a very large movement that had flown under the radar. And I had never heard of it. But once I started learning about this movement and recognizing the teachings and the terminology and the practices, all of a sudden I started realizing it was all around me. There were signs of its influence all around me. I just really began researching the movement at that time, not realizing that later that myself and I would be able to persuade Doug to team up with me and that we would be writing a book responding to this movement, because quite a amount of time passed and I hadn't seen very many books responding to the teachings of this movement, but it kept growing and growing. And so that's how I initially found out about this movement.
And Doug, what was your response? I mean, had you been exposed to the NAR? What got you deep into it as well?
Well, Holly reached out to me and said that she had learned about this movement and had done quite a bit of research. By the time I heard about it, she had already investigated it very thoroughly and had done quite a bit of writing, extensively writing on the topic. And she wanted to know what I thought about the possibility of joining forces to respond to this. And I must say that initially I wasn't really sure what contribution I could make because, again, I had not heard of the movement. I had not heard of anything called the New Apostolic Reformation. Now, again, this was a number of years ago. We're talking 10 years ago, I suppose. So something like that, anyway, maybe 10 or so years. It was rampant at the time, but it didn't go by any particular name, and it wasn't all that familiar by that label to me. Yeah. And we should talk about that a little bit more because there's a sense in which that's still the case. But I said, well, I'd like to see what you've written on it. Can you send me anything? And as I read, I became concerned, and that's what happens. Now, I have a general concern about the health of the church and about discipleship and about true worship and biblical preaching and the gospel. If I can stand in the gap to help protect, the truth is revealed in the scriptures, that's something I care about doing. But I also saw that there was an important apologetics component here. And this is something your listeners will be familiar with, of course, because of the nature of your show. In general, you're concerned with issues across the whole range of this general subject matter, apologetics. My concern was I could see that if people were sucked into this movement, they might become disillusioned when they realize that it can't live up to its press. It can't live up to the expectations that are projected all the time. Yeah. Then what happens? What do people do? Where do they go next when they leave disillusioned with the only version of Christianity they've ever encountered? And with what everybody was hailing around them to be the best version of Christian truth and Christian experience, with an emphasis on experience, of course. Yeah. So I was concerned about where this might leave people who were disillusioned and not sure what to believe as a result of expectations being disappointed. Yeah. And so I said, yeah, let's do this. And of course, the more I got into it, the more interested I became, because we were looking at very specific things like how verses would be used in the Bible and distorted, and the practice, the hermeneutics involved in interpreting a passage just seemed so irresponsible to me that whenever you see that, regardless of what else is going on around the movement, you have to correct that, and you want to help people see that there's a way to use the scriptures that, it distorts the truth. So there are lots of little lessons as well, apart from the larger concern about the dangers of the movement itself.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, I was telling Chad prior to the interview that had things gone differently for me coming out of that sort of environment, if I hadn't have accidentally landed in a church that was having a service with a panel of apologists talking about that you can trust the Bible, that how would I have kind of refound my footing? Because I was having all kinds of doubts and who can I trust? And well, I can't deny God exists, but why should I even trust the Bible? You know, everything I've been taught here is just a sham here. I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah, you can feel like you're a spiritual refugee. You know, maybe you experience a community a certain way and you experience fellowship that way. Your friends are associated with the movement or the church that you're part of, and it's NAR, it's New Apostolic. And then you begin to have questions, maybe some doubts. Maybe you don't know who to ask for answers to your questions, and you're on your own. And eventually you find yourself sort of on the outside looking in. And then maybe people aren't even that willing to talk to you anymore because you have doubts and suspicions, and they will kind of hold you at arm's length even. And that's a typical response, in fact, among groups, NAR groups. So you can feel very much like you've been cast aside, that you're kind of a refugee without a home and you don't know where to land, right?
Yeah.
So we find that to be true for many people.
It echoes my experience, what I have been reading in the books that you wrote. Anyone who would leave the church, there was something wrong with them. They were sort of demonized. There was some bad story circulated about them. Don't listen to them. Don't talk to them. They're shunned. And I thought, man, they were really good people leaving, but man, I couldn't believe they would be so bad. you know, stories were told about me after the fact as well. But before we go into all of that, now we know, the importance of addressing this. We kind of need to go back and say, okay, what are we talking about when we talk about the New Apostolic Reformation? Assuming that there's plenty of people listening that are like, okay, what are you talking about?
I would say it's a movement that has arisen within Protestant Christianity, and initially out of independent charismatic churches, but has since become more mainstreamed. And it's a movement whose leaders teach that that God is restoring apostles and prophets to the church, and that these apostles and prophets are supposed to govern the church, and they're bringing critical new revelation that all churches, all Christians need in order to develop miraculous powers, in order to wage spiritual warfare that's necessary in order to bring God's kingdom to earth. And so the goal is to bring God's kingdom to earth. And they would say, but the reason the church has not, and it's kind of a redefinition of the Great Commission, is it's a dominionism. We bring God's kingdom to earth. But the way you do that is through signs and wonders, working these miraculous signs and wonders that are even as amazing or more amazing than the miracles that Jesus worked. And the problem is the church hasn't been able to do this. It hasn't been able to bring God's kingdom to earth for 2,000 years. And that's because apostles and prophets have been missing. They have the keys. They have the new revelations that Christians need to develop these miraculous powers to bring God's kingdom to earth. So that's the teachings in a nutshell. When I say it arose out of independent charismatic churches, starting in like around the 1980s, 1990s, early 2000s. And since then, though, the teachings have become very widespread throughout charismatic churches, throughout many Pentecostal churches. And then even beyond that, the teachings have been making a lot of inroads into non-denominational churches, and even many more traditional and more denominational churches as well recently. And a lot of that has to do with the music, that is Bethel music, the different NAR music that's used commonly in many churches, along with some other things as well we can talk about.
So you talked a bit about, and this was evident through reading the book, of how influential the movement has become. And I actually, Holly, really resonated with what you said, in the sense that when my wife was actually saved in a New Apostolic Reformation church, they brought in prophets from the Elijah list. They brought in people from the Toronto Blessing, and she experienced a wide gamut of things. But through talking to her and also talking to Brian, I kind of had an experience like yours, where I thought, wow, this is actually like more influential than I realized, even though it might not have the NAR title, if you will. And so what I'm wondering is what kind of distinguishes the New Apostolic movement from other Christian beliefs, such as Pentecostals or charismatics?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that because we really emphasize that there is a difference, a big difference. So what distinguishes the movement is the New Apostolic Reformation leaders will say that apostles and prophets must govern the church. These are formal, governing, hierarchical offices in church government. So historically, Pentecostals or charismatics would say that there is a spiritual gift of prophecy, that there are individuals within the church whom God has gifted to give prophetic words to individuals or local churches. Or they might say that there are people who are apostolically gifted in the sense that they're these really effective church planners or missionaries. But they would not say, Pentecostals historically would not say that apostles and prophets are to hold formal governing offices in the church. And that's the key, really key pivotal difference. And for that reason, many Pentecostals and charismatics have been very concerned about this movement, and they've been warning about this movement as well, because the teachings go way beyond what classic Pentecostals, historic charismatics would teach. And when I say so the authority of apostles and prophets is considered very great in this movement. So that a prophet, when they speak, their words are to be taken very seriously. They may introduce their words with the phrase, "Thus saith the Lord" at times, but their words are to be taken very seriously. And they give words not just to individuals or to local churches, but if they can give words to the global church in many cases, to entire nations. And with apostles, they typically are not just within a single church. Many times they would govern an apostolic network that can sometimes have hundreds or even thousands of churches, like the Apostle Cheon in Pasadena. It oversees Harvest International Ministry, which is a network of thousands of churches and ministries that he is seen as governing over. And so their authority goes very deep and it goes very wide. And whereas Pentecostals and charismatics would not see people who have these spiritual gifts of prophecy or apostleship as possessing that level of authority.
Now, Holly and Doug, would they say that when they say, "Thus saith the Lord," would they say that their statements or their proclamations have equal footing with Scripture?
Yeah, I could let Doug. I want to let Doug talk here too. I would say no. They would all say no. Their prophetic words do not have the authority of Scripture. But the problem is, there is what they say, but then it's how it's played out in actual practice. Right. And so when you have prophets who are claiming to give revelation that the global church needs to accept, or else it won't be able to fulfill its mission on earth to bring God's kingdom to earth, then in effect, their words are being treated on a par with Scripture, because only Scripture has that kind of binding authority. So even though they would say, definitely we don't equate our words with Scripture, it's how they're actually presented and treated in practice. And Doug may want to jump in there too.
Well, they have a logical problem here, Chad, because the source is the same in any case, right? It is God speaking. If it's prophetic, it is because God has spoken and he has revealed something to them. So it has the stamp of divine authority in the nature of the case. It cannot be otherwise. And yet they know that it's more or less scandalous to suppose that anything that they utter could be treated as having equal authority with the Scriptures themselves, the canonical Scriptures. So you see, there's a problem for them. It's definitely a problem, because what you would have to say is something like, well, we can receive prophecies, but they do have to have the same authority of any word that God speaks, because God cannot lie, right? And so his words don't come to prophets with varying degrees of authority. So it's not possible. So you can't explain the difference that way. So you'd have to say, well, it's sort of like the difference between, maybe what Paul was doing when he was preaching the gospel and then what Luke was doing when he was writing it down for the book of Acts. And in the book of Acts, you have, a canonical book. It's Scripture, and the actual sermon that Paul preached, let's say it's one that was not recorded. We don't even know the words of it. Maybe he received that as a revelation from God for the purposes of that occasion, but it's not incorporated into the text of Scripture. But I'm actually trying to nuance this as carefully as I think they should, even though they generally don't do this very effectively. And even if you say that, you then have to say, well, what do you mean by difference in authority? Because if you're my audience and I am the prophet and I receive a word from God and I tell you this is what I believe God has told me, then it has authority for you, you would think. And if you say, well, it has diminished authority, it's not because of the source. So the difference must be in me and in the mechanism of revelation and in my communication of it to you. And so they might think that there are ways that things can go wrong in that string of events, in that series, where my receptivity could be off a bit, or my ability to articulate it effectively to you might be a little bit off, might not get it exactly right, or you may not receive it and hear it as it should be heard. And so there are ways it can break down, but you can't attribute the breakdown to God himself. That at that point, on the front end of the revelatory process, it can't really be different. But if I claim to be a prophet and not just telling you what I think God's mind is in a matter, notice those are two different things. Mm-hmm. I might be exercising biblical wisdom, where I'm thinking of the ways that God works in the world and of his character and the plans he has in general terms, and what he's done and how church history is unfolded. And you come to me with a question about your future or what have you, and I might give you some advice, and I might say, well, I'm only going to give you the wisdom that I have, and you trust that it's informed by my knowledge of God, my relationship with God, my knowledge of the Word of God, and so forth. But I don't purport that what I tell you is a revelation from God. I don't purport to be a prophet. Now, what I tell you will have some weight for you, won't it? It will still have some authority for you. That's why you came and you asked me, and you trust me, and you think that I'm someone who might be able to share some wisdom, spiritual wisdom derived from Scripture. But you know to be careful not to think that it is infallible. You know to be careful not to think that I am necessarily right about this. But what if you come to me believing that I'm a prophet? Well, I think your expectation's going to be different. I think if I, as a prophet, and you believing that I'm a prophet, tell you that God has said this or that, you're going to think that it has the same weight that anything that you read in the Bible has, and perhaps more weight because it's very specific to your circumstances, right? You're not left wondering anymore, well, now how does this passage apply to me? I can tell you the answer to that because I know you, I know your circumstances, and I'm speaking prophetically directly into those limited conditions. So in some ways, practically speaking, you will receive it as if it has even greater authority for you because it's targeted to your specific needs. Mm-hmm. You see the difference. So now you've got wisdom, the wisdom model on the one hand, where you're receiving wise counsel and biblically informed counsel, and on the other hand, you're getting it from a prophet. Now, surely those are not the same thing. And we don't think that the weight that a wise counselor has is trivial. So just exactly why or what do we mean when we say that a prophetic word for your special circumstances, when revealed by God, it is not on equal footing with Scripture? I think all it means is it's not Scripture, but it doesn't mean that it lacks the same level of authority and purchase on your life. And would you be, let's suppose that you went out after I advised you and you did something different than I suggested. Would that be disobedience to the revealed will of God? Probably not.
No.
But if I was speaking as a prophet and I told you this is what you should do, or I told you something and the implication was this is what you should do, right? And you don't do it. Now, the question of obedience is a completely different thing. It's like, well, did you just disobey the actual will of God as expressed by the prophet? So I don't know. There's this logical problem. So on the one hand, as Holly said, the answer to your question is yes, they will say there's a difference, but then you have to look at the question, well, what difference does it make when it comes down to actual practice and obedience? We talk about prophecy that's actionable. I like that phrase, actionable prophecy, because actionable prophecy is prophecy that implicitly calls on you to act a certain way or to believe something in particular, right? You have to do something with it, and that's why you are the recipient of that revelation. Now, some prophecy might not be particularly actionable, except in a limited sense. It might be informational. But even informational is actionable on the belief level because you either believe it or you don't believe it. Now, some information that you receive might not be actionable information, right? You might be told something you can't do anything about. They just tell you factually, this is what's going to happen, and you just have to wait for it to happen. But other times you're told, here's what's going to happen unless you do this. Okay, now it's actionable. And what I want to say is, if you're receiving fallible prophecies or prophecies that don't really carry the full weight of God's authority, then you don't really know what to do about it. You don't know whether to believe it, and you don't know whether to act on it. It's not actionable, even though the content itself implies that it is. Now, I don't think God would choose a mechanism for revealing his will to you if it was meant to be trusted implicitly, if it could also be mistaken.
It's really helpful.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's helpful. Thank you.
So many good distinctions there. That leads me to another question along the lines of prophecy or prophets and apostles. Back to authority. Who says someone is an apostle or a prophet within this movement? How do they get their authority? I mean, I know what I think is the case, but how would you describe what you've learned?
Well, so what leaders in this movement will say is that God gives someone the spiritual gift of prophecy or the spiritual gift of apostleship, but that gift will be recognized by others. And then people will recognize, oh, this person is an apostle, this person is a prophet. And so the office will be conferred on the person, often during a formal commissioning ceremony. And it will often be led by other apostles or prophets who will lay their hands on that person and publicly commission this person as an apostle or as a prophet. In some cases, people will enroll in classes and courses and where they pay money and receive training, and that will often result in a certificate or something also saying that they're an apostle or a prophet.
Yeah, so you'll have certain ministries that'll be like, oh, our School of the Prophets course, or learn how to perform miracles, that sort of a thing. I've seen those things advertised on various lists and things that you can subscribe to.
There are other things to say about that. When you're presented with a claim that so-and-so is a prophet, or if a person claims to have uttered a prophecy, and these can take different forms, for example. So we might eventually talk about ways they pray sometimes that are supposed to be prophetic, with prayers of declaration, for example. Yeah. But going back to my point, the point I wanted to make is that you should be asking yourself the question, well, how would I know for sure that this person is a prophet? Or what would give me a good enough grounds to believe that this person is a prophet, so that if I hear what he says, I know what to do? How do I know whether to believe this particular revelation claim? What is my evidence for that? And so Holly mentioned the formal commissioning. And for some people, that'll just be sufficient. They'll think that the people that are doing the commissioning already have the relevant authority. They would know. And so if they lay hands on someone else and declare them to be prophets, then we can trust them too. Or it may be that the School of Supernatural Ministries at Bethel Church in Redding, California, has a curriculum where they purport to train people to be prophetic, to train them in the prophetic. Then you think, okay, well, we trust those people. We trust the leaders of the church. We trust the curriculum. They wouldn't be doing that if that wasn't the case. And so when they graduate a student and say that this person now is skilled in the prophetic, or however they would want to describe it, you simply believe it because you believe in the process. You accept the process, the commissioning process, the educational process, or what have you. But you've just moved the question back one step. What you have to do is you have to ask, well, why do we trust this process? Why do we why do we believe that these people commissioning this individual now as a prophet really have the authority to do that? So you can't just have an infinite chain of individuals, declaring other people to be prophets. There's got to be some,
that's what I was thinking,
right? Ultimate grounds for this. And so for any particular prophet, and you want to know. And this is also problematic because they have sometimes gotten into trouble commissioning someone who proved to be an embarrassment to the movement. And now what do you do with that? So I think what that does then is it raises questions about the authority of the individuals and even the wisdom of the individuals in commissioning that person as a prophet. So we have distinguished between tests that are positive and negative, tests that are positive and tests that are negative for prophetic utterances or for the thesis that a particular person is a prophet. So a negative test would be something like, we might ask the question, is what the person prophesies compatible with what the Bible teaches? Or does it contradict the Bible in any way? If the answer is, well, it does contradict, then it fails the test. It is a negative test. We know that it is not prophecy. Another test would be, well, what's their track record? Do they generally get things right? Have they always been successful and in every detail when they have prophesied some series of events? And if the answer is no, well, then we believe they have failed a negative test. They are not prophets because they have not passed that test. But that leaves open the question, well, how do you ever know whether they actually are? Maybe they get it right and they're lucky. They just have a great track record and they're good guessers. Or, maybe the things they prophesy about really don't even touch on the content of Scripture at all. So there's never really a question of contradiction. So does that mean that they are prophets? And the answer, of course, is no. It doesn't mean that because you've passed those tests, you count as a prophet. What is the real evidence that you are a prophet is the question. What is the real evidence that what you've just now uttered truly is from God? On what basis are we supposed to believe that? We need positive evidence for that claim. And I truly believe that this is one of the great missing components in the overall assessment of the movement, that people are reluctant to say, well, you really have a burden to show me that I am to trust you as a spokesperson for God. All right. So just being commissioned by another person who was commissioned by somebody else who might have been commissioned by somebody else who's now dead and we can't even talk to is no help to us at all. So we might go to the Scriptures and ask, well, how were prophets recognized to be authorized by God? I think that's a very interesting study, but it doesn't. They don't hold up so well when we look for the same positive criteria for many of these contemporary prophets today.
Again, very helpful distinctions. I know there's so much to cover that we can't cover in our interview today, so I always want to point people back to the books where you cover things so much more thoroughly. But I do want to ask a question that would maybe sort of help people who are wondering, like, well, I've never heard of this, but I've seen some of the things. And I asked my pastor about the New Apostolic Reformation, and he knew nothing about it, yet we're doing all of these things. Or they could say, it seems like people are evasive, or they don't want to hear this. No, we're not NAR. So I tend to think that there's a little bit of evasiveness on the count of some. When does one become in the movement, I guess, is the question. You could be not know anything about it, but you've picked up these sorts of teachings and you're under these sorts of teachings, or a church is in that. So could it be that they're in the movement and they don't know about it because they haven't heard about it? They just absorb this way of going about things. Oh, well, they're prophets or they're apostles.
The core defining teaching of this movement, of course, is that apostles and prophets must govern churches. And so anyone who teaches that, a leader who teaches that, we would say, by definition is a part of this movement if they're promoting that teaching. And then there's a lot of course, related teachings that flow out of that teaching and practices. And so you can see these other teachings and practices, and often they will be clues or signs that if you see a lot of these practices, that someone is probably NAR, part of the New Apostolic Reformation. But that's the core teaching. But we would also say that leaders who are constantly sharing platforms with other apostles and prophets, they're speaking at the conferences, they're promoting the teachings or the practices, they're right, they're endorsing the books of the leaders in this movement, they would be part of this movement too. So a movement, and as you mentioned, the evasiveness, there have been some leaders in this movement who have said, I don't accept the label New Apostolic Reformation, or I don't really know what that label means. I don't self-identify as part of the New Apostolic Reformation. The thing is, that term came from one of the early influential apostles in this movement, C. Peter Wagner, developed that term. It caught on, but he used this term. He saw these churches that were starting to promote the idea that apostles and prophets must govern churches. He was looking for a label for this movement. himself being a part of it. He came up with that label and it caught on. There are leaders today who use the label of themselves. For example, Cheon is one of the most influential apostles in this movement, and he will say he uses the term New Apostolic Reformation. Other leaders in this movement don't use that term, but if they hold to the key teachings, the apostles and prophets must govern, then we would say they are part of this movement, whether they want to admit that or not, whether they recognize that or not. And frankly, it doesn't really matter that you use the label. If they want to say they're part of the Apostolic Prophetic Movement, if they want to give it another name, the label's not as important. What's important is, do they believe that apostles and prophets must govern the church and that they are giving critical new revelation that Christians must accept and that Christians must come under their authority? So if they believe those things, that's really what's of issue here.
Yes.
Yes. They can't really, the only way you could legitimately say, I am not NAR, we use that just as a convenient abbreviation, I'm not NAR, is if they actually explicitly deny or repudiate these central tenets. Because it's not the name of an organization. This is not the name of a church or an organization that's registered somewhere as the New Apostolic Reformation. And they try to exploit that. They'll say, well, no, we're not part of any special network that's called this. So what we say is, well, look, anybody who believes these things falls under this category. There's a label for that. There's a name now that's caught on. It's just a sociological inevitability for them now that this is what the language means. And if you believe these things, then you are NAR, whether you want to be called that or not. You can call yourself whatever you want. And so we don't get hung up on the language either, except that you do need convenient language to be able to talk about what is going on here in this movement. Michael Brown is an example of someone who has many friends who are really big wigs in the movement. And he is very defensive about this. He doesn't like this language. He wants to do away with this talk. This, I think, is just for damage control and in the interests of defending friends of his in the movement, and maybe trying to deflect scrutiny of the degree to which he might have a real affinity for the movement. So, but it doesn't work because it's language that does now have an established use, practically official use, for people who believe and practice certain things, like Holly just described. And so, but that doesn't mean, though, that people will recognize that what they're doing actually is called that by somebody or other. So you might go to a church and you might say, I'm looking for a church, but one thing I want to be really careful about is I want to know what their position is about NAR, about the New Apostolic Reformation. I might say, about the what? What's that? And you do a little digging and you find out that this church believes all the central things that a NAR church would, and they never use the language. And some people, quite honestly, might say, I've never even heard that word before or that terminology before. That's irrelevant. So that's not the right question. You don't want to ask the question, are you New Apostolic? I mean, you could, and you might get some help with it, but it's not going to be very telling if they say, well, no, what is that? So you want to ask other questions. You want to ask, well, here's an example. I visited a church a couple of years ago in Los Angeles where I was visiting with friends. And afterwards, I already had a very strong impression from being in the service that this was a NAR church. And I asked one of the ministers, I said, are there any apostles here at your church? See, I didn't ask, is this a New Apostolic Reformation church? He would have said no. And he did say, we don't have any apostles here, but our mother church does. I said, oh, I'm interested in that. Can you tell me more? Who are the apostles at this other church? What church is that? What is your relationship to that church? And so on. Do you ever hear prophecies in services during, on Sunday mornings or when you gather? What about prayers of declaration? And you might even have to describe that. So it's better to talk about particular things that they believe and particular practices that they use and describe them as necessary. And then people will say, oh, well, if that's what you're talking about, well, then yes, we do that sort of thing here. That is exactly what we believe. I've talked to missionaries from China, for example, or Brazil, and sometimes I'll do this experimentally. Have you heard of the NAR the New Apostolic Reformation in that country where you minister? Nope, never have. What is it? Who are some people involved with it? And I began to tell them, oh, yeah, that's all around us. We've got that for sure. I just didn't know it was called that.
Yeah.
So it would be incumbent upon us to kind of know those central tenets so that we can tease that out when we are talking to other people.
Yes, and I would say knowing some of the key leaders of the movement, like Bill Johnson and Chris Vallotton, the apostle and prophet out of Bethel Church in Redding, Mike Bickle at the International House of Prayer in Kansas City, Missouri, Randy Clark, who's an apostle over Global Awakening Network, Heidi Baker from Iris Global, Cindy Jacobs. These are some of the names. Lou Engle, he's hosted prayer and fasting rallies in large stadiums throughout the United States and in some different nations of the world. So these are some of the names to look out for. And then practices like Doug mentioned, prayers of declaration, strategic level spiritual warfare, 24/7 prayer rooms are often a sign of NAR influence, just because the International House of Prayer in Kansas City, Missouri popularized the idea of starting up those rooms. These are some of the treasure hunting evangelism. That's a type of prophetic evangelism. Maybe we can talk about later. These are all different practices. The idea of activating miraculous gifts in individuals. The idea that everybody kind of has these latent spiritual gifts, but they need activating. And the way you activate them is by taking part in prophetic activation exercises. And so that could involve things like two people getting back to back and being blindfolded and not knowing who's behind them, and then asking God to tell them information about the person behind them. For example, the person's birthday or what their favorite color is or something like that. I mean, these are the type of prophetic activation exercises that are promoted by Bethel Church and Redding, all kinds of similar exercises. Imagining that there's closing your eyes and pretending there's a purple elephant in front of you or something, and then just what pictures pop into your mind as prophetic words and these kind of things, kind of almost like games, parlor games or something. And so the prophetic activation is another real sign of NAR influence.
Another one that might be a strong signal would be whether the minister there uses the Passion Translation when preaching, or whether it's a popular translation, so-called translation, because this was translated by a fellow named Brian Simmons, who is himself a prominent figure in the NAR movement. His NAR propensities, to put it mildly, they figure prominently in his interpretation of the passages that he purports to have translated. So that's a kind of a danger signal too, is if people are friendly towards the use of the Passion Translation.
As a quick note, a side note on that, I noticed that Bible Gateway has just recently pulled that version off their website, so at least that's good.
Well, that's a good note, because, you know, this is a movement. What that means is that it has momentum, and its tentacles reach into some of the most unlikely of places, unexpected places, and in ways that are very subtle and initially might seem very harmless. So, for example, through Bethel music, people will begin to, their exposure to the movement will come through the music, maybe being used in their church, which is otherwise a sound church. You know, they might pick up a copy of the Passion Translation or what have you. But it's a movement then that can kind of flood the crevices of the churches in ways that don't even require explicit teaching so much. To respond to a movement like this and to be able to turn back the tide and its influence really takes a movement, a counter movement, a resistance, you might even call it. We're seeing this happening, and we're not alone in speaking out about this and expressing our concerns publicly. And of course, we're corresponding routinely with people who have left NAR churches and are looking for some direction. But it really takes a movement to turn back a movement like this one. And we think that this decision, for example, that Bible Gateway made to remove it from its list of translations was a prudent decision that may have been a response to legitimate, really solid, sound criticism by reputable people, criticism of the strategies for translation. and of the tactics that were used and of the aims and the results that they got. So, yeah, that's a very positive sign that people are waking up to this and becoming more alert to it and taking greater care and in their resistance to it.
Yeah, I have a few thoughts. The first one was that, I'm glad that you clarified that there are different signs that your church may be influenced in this way and what those things might be. I mean, I remember in the church I was in, Churchquake was the C. Peter Wagner book. We're recommending this, the whole church read this because this is what God is doing. So it was very clear to me when I heard that term. I was like, oh, I thought we were one of the few churches, that were, doing the thing that God wanted to do. And then now after the fact and thinking like, well, that's behind me. That was weird. And I'm thinking, wait, this is happening everywhere, or at least in a greater dimension than I could have imagined. But I was thinking when you were talking there, Doug and Holly, that, what would someone that is plugged into this movement be thinking? And the thing that comes to my mind is like, you know what? God is moving and the church is growing. Intellectual churches are dead churches. The reason this is such a big movement is because this is what God's doing. People are being delivered. Maybe there have been some abuses or wrong prophecies, but those are what's being focused on. That doesn't invalidate the movement or what God's doing. This is the new move of God. I've been healed. I've received prophecies that came true. You're just a cessationist, and you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and it's this sort of intellectualism that's stopping the move of God. Now, that's probably what I would say 20 years ago, and I'm just wondering, where do you begin when there's so many strands there that all interlock? What do I hang on to, and what do I get rid of?
Yeah, I'd say you can't trust the truth of a message by church growth or by feelings, and that's why I really like to go to the core of the teachings of the movement, the teaching that apostles and prophets must govern the church. To take that teaching, isolate it, and ask someone to support that from Scripture. And, there are a few key verses they'll use, Ephesians 4:11, Ephesians 2:20, 1 Corinthians 12:28. They'll point to these verses, but if you really take them to those verses and look at them and encourage them to look at those verses in context, they can see that those verses are not being used in context, that those verses are not saying that apostles and prophets must hold formal offices, hierarchical offices in church government. So really, if you can deal with that teaching, the rest of the practices and teachings really hinge on that teaching, I would say, because the authority of the apostles is, once you remove this extraordinary authority that these apostles must govern the church, and then all the other teachings kind of crumble. For example, strategic level spiritual warfare is the practice that in order for the gospel to go forth with effectiveness, people must bind the powerful demonic spirits, the territorial spirits they call them, that are believed to be ruling over cities and nations. And the way you do that is you go to a certain city or a nation and you confront the territorial spirit, this demonic spirit that's believed to be ruling over, with warfare prayer, and you engage in these prophetic acts like pouring anointing oil on the ground and all of these things. But this is all done under the authority of the apostle. The apostle is the one that has the authority to confront this powerful demonic spirit, and he alone or she alone has that authority. So if you go after the proof text they use, inappropriately to support their key teachings, I think these other related practices will all eventually they'll see that they crumble. It will undermine all of those.
Yes, you have to ask the question, whenever you're presented with something to do or to believe, on what basis should I do this? On what basis am I to believe that this is true? On what basis am I to believe that this is a practice that God would have us perform? Of course, ultimately, we think so much of it depends on what the Scriptures teach. So you test the spirits largely, as John would have us do from his first letter, 1 John 4. Test the spirits in all things, primarily by appeal to Scripture. And if there is a conflict between what you're hearing and what you're seeing on the one hand and what the Bible teaches on the other, then you know you've got a problem and you know where the problem is. And one way to do the test, of course, is to see how the Bible is actually used. So it isn't enough to know that the people will preach from the Bible, that they will use some translation, maybe even a legitimate translation, maybe the English Standard Version or the New King James or the New American Standard Version, maybe the Revised Standard Version might be used in your church. But if they're misinterpreting the passages, it doesn't matter. If they're interpreting them along NAR lines to say things that are not actually said there, then you already know that there's a problem. And it doesn't matter that you feel good, that your emotions are up, that the people are warm and friendly, and your children love going to Sunday school there. None of that helps you know by itself that what you are hearing and seeing is true or authentic. I'll give you one example. In John's Gospel, chapter 14, Jesus has his disciples with him in the upper room, and he says, the works that I've done, you too will do, and greater works than these. And he uses that word works. And the English word for the Greek word in that text is the word works. But Brian Simmons, for example, has translated that to read the miracles that I do, and greater miracles will you do. So now the question doesn't even arise, what does Jesus mean by his works? The reader is just being told, it has to mean this.
Yeah.
And I've heard Bill Johnson, for example, say in his preaching, that's the only thing it could possibly mean. Well, that's simply not true. Even if it is what it means, it's not the only thing that it could mean. And the fact is, it means something different than what he says. And so, even though you see them using the scriptures to support their claims, you have to be very discerning about whether the scriptures actually teach what they say that they do. And that's one of our primary tests for the truth, right? Not how does it feel? Does it sound good? Are there enough people around me who also believe this? Is it backed up by spectacular claims of the miraculous and so forth that I've never seen performed myself? These are all important questions about how you would even know to believe that this is the case. It's not unusual for us to hear someone say, I've heard a lot about Bethel Church, and I some things I know I would disagree with, but clearly God is doing a work there. I can't tell you how many times somebody has said that to me. I was teaching a class a couple of years ago, and I was telling my students this, and it was a 3-hour class, so we were about to take a break, and I was just telling them that oftentimes I hear people say this. We took a break, and I went downstairs, and I ran into one of my colleagues, and he said, what's going on? And he said he'd recently been somewhere, and he was thinking about going to Reading. And I said, what would be your purpose for going to Reading? And he said he wanted to visit Bethel Church. And I said, really, what are your thoughts about Bethel? And he said, well, I don't agree with everything, but I know God is doing a work there. And when I went back to class, I told my students, well, it just happened again. And I can tell you right now, it happened to me again about 3 nights ago when I was talking to a young lady in Los Angeles. I said, what I hear a lot of the time is, there's a lot I don't agree with, and she said, but God's clearly doing a work there, right? It's almost like a talking point. So now what I like to ask are 2 questions. Number 1, what do you disagree with? And number 2, how do you know that God is working there? What is your evidence for that? And of course, the evidence is supposed to be the spectacular miracles, the warmth, the vivaciousness of the congregation. And I've been to the church, and I've sat in a service at Bethel Church, and I know what they're referring to. You can experience that in other churches, to be sure. But even though a church should be vibrant, you can't take the vibrancy measure of a church, the decibel level of a church's music or something, as a measure of the truth of what they're saying.
Yes.
As you both are talking, one of the things that keeps coming to the forefront of my mind that is just baffling to me within this movement is that there have been numerous prophets, and I'm going to use one that's a popular example, that, for example, prophesied within this movement that Donald Trump was going to take office again. And then, of course, he didn't. The election happened, and it was announced and projected that Biden was going to be the president. And then, of course, he was the president-elect. And even during that time, those same prophets were hanging on to this and saying that God was going to swoop in at the last minute, and Donald Trump was going to be in office. And then even when Biden actually became president, he put his hand on the Bible and was sworn in, they were saying that he would be the president again during Biden's first 4 years, that somehow God was going to remove Biden and Trump would come in. And so my question is with such obvious botched, failed prophecies, whatever word you want to use, but yet there are still people that continue to believe these people. It's a very simple question. It's not very intellectually eloquent, but why is that? What's going on there?
Well, yeah, there are many people who still follow these people. And, you know, it's a teaching in this movement that you can be a genuine prophet of God and make mistakes when you prophesy. And so, for example, one of the prophets Chris Vallotton, the prophet at Bethel Church, the chief prophet there, he was one of the prophets who prophesied that Trump would be elected. And then he, when he got it wrong, he put an apology out. And first he pulled the apology, he put it on Facebook, but then people said, oh, you know, you apologize too soon. There's still a chance, because this is when some people thought the election was still in doubt. And so he pulled the apology and then put it back up after Joe Biden, I think the election results were certified. And he said, you know, I realize this creates a credibility gap, but it doesn't make me a false prophet. And, you know, what was interesting in the comments on Facebook, if you read it, people were talking about just how humble Chris Vallotton was and what an amazing example he was setting, and his apology. And it was almost like it, in their mind, gave him greater credibility that he apologized. But it's a common teaching in this movement. So there really are allowances for prophets to make those kind of mistakes and still be considered genuine prophets. I guess they've kind of hedged things that way, so it allows them to do that.
So they're pretty much ignoring what Scripture says about how you can tell the difference between a genuine prophet and not. And then it seems to me also that that's quite the safeguard, and why someone like Sid Roth can say something along the lines of, even if the prophets are wrong, it doesn't mean God's wrong, and I'm still going to believe the prophets.
Right. Well, so Wayne Grudem has a book called The Gift of Prophecy, and he's really popularized the idea that the New Testament gift of prophecy is fallible, that New Testament prophets can make mistakes in prophesying, but Wayne Grudem would say that they don't have the same level of authority as Old Testament prophets, and prophets today don't hold governing offices. But what happened is, and so that's very different, because NAR leaders will say that they do hold formal governing offices. They do have this great authority. But people in NAR have latched on to Wayne Grudem's teachings in defense of their belief that prophets in New Testament times can make mistakes in prophesying.
Okay.
Yeah, but you see, the support for that is not strong at all. I mean, it's a very difficult position, because to support it from Scripture, you have to connect dots, in some cases of which don't exist. And you have to nuance passages so that it can seem like, well, this is a possibility. At the very most, it's a remote possibility. It's not taught explicitly in Scripture at all. They also believe that they can identify one or two cases of fallible prophecy in the book of Acts. They think that Agabus, for example, gave a fallible prophecy concerning who would actually arrest the Apostle Paul under certain conditions that were described. And I believe that they're mistaken in the way that they interpret the passage. That, as a matter of fact, Agabus' prophecy came true exactly as he gave it. But this is the strategy. And it looks to me like what's driving the hermeneutic, the method in interpretation, is a desire to be able to defend the fallibility of the gift, because it seems to me that otherwise it's very hard to find a legitimate prophet in the world today. I've been corresponding actually with other New Testament scholars, and I say other New Testament scholars, I mean other than people like Grudem, who's a theologian. I don't mean people like myself, because I'm not trained, I don't have a PhD in New Testament studies. My field is philosophy, and I have a biblical studies degree at the graduate level. But I correspond with these people, and many of them are friends of mine, and some of them are people who disagree with me, of course. I was discussing this matter with one who does believe that New Testament prophecy is fallible. And I said, well, there's a real practical problem here for me, and that is this business about being actionable again. If I know in advance that what you tell me as a fallible prophet might not be true, what am I supposed to do? And he wrote me back in response to that, and he said, well, actually, that's one reason why I'm very cautious about prophecy. And he said it has to be tested with Scripture, and the person has to have a very good track record. Well, I would like to know who that is. Who, for example, does have such a good track record that you would believe what they have to say. Now, it still doesn't solve the problem, because in principle, they are saying that even an individual with a good track record could get it wrong. Well, as long as it's always possible, whenever you speak to me prophetically, that you are wrong, I am not quite sure what I should do or what I should believe. So I think this is a very serious obstacle, and it's a reason why the test of an Old Testament prophet was so severe. And I mean severe in two respects. One is you couldn't get it wrong once and still be considered a legitimate prophet. And number two, if you were discovered to be a false prophet, you were to be stoned. So God took this pretty seriously, and he implemented the strongest possible measures for deterring people from claiming to be prophets when they weren't really legitimate prophets.
The New Testament talks about that there are false prophets and false apostles. Within this movement that seems to have the majority of people calling themselves apostles and prophets, have they identified amongst their own anyone who is, don't listen to that guy, they're a false prophet, because we know there are many false prophets. Don't listen to this guy, he's a false apostle. Within the movement, are there controls for determining who are false prophets and apostles? Or is it just wild, wild west?
Yeah, I would say from what I've seen in my research, it's very rare to see a leader in this movement warn about someone else. Some years back, Bill Johnson gave a warning about a certain individual who I think this individual was seen as teaching some really crazy, far out things. And I can't even remember the name of the individual right now. I don't know if that person even claimed to be a prophet or an apostle, but Bill Johnson did give a warning about this person. But generally, I don't actually run across very often warnings. In fact, what I often hear is that people in the church are overly concerned about false apostles and false prophets. That's the kind of, I've heard a little bit of that from Bill Johnson, that, people are too concerned about false apostles and false prophets. And because of that, it's made people too vigilant and too cautious. Yes, too cautious. And so, I would say, I don't know if Doug wants to jump in there, but I would say that's very rare.
Yeah, this is another problem, right? Because prophecy also seems to work somehow in tandem with their understanding of how faith works. So when you prophesy, it's as if you might jinx the prophecy if you don't believe it.
Yeah.
It's almost like don't tell anybody your wish or it won't come true.
Yeah, well, it's a straightforward form of superstition, right? When you think that but then you add this mixture here where you're saying this about God, that God is going to come through with his promises, but only if you continue to believe them. And so every prophecy is virtually conditional. It's almost there's almost this built-in condition that this is going to happen, but you better keep your faith up strong. And of course, we all know that God will fulfill his promises. He has unconditional promises, and he will fulfill those promises regardless of our circumstances and the conditions. And there are times when he promises something to us that's conditional. It's conditional on our obedience, for example. Usually it's conditional on our obedience. It's generally not conditional on some ethereal, subjective feeling of faith in God. God doesn't make that a necessary condition for fulfilling his promises. He knows our weaknesses. He knows of our doubts. He knows of our difficulties. We can come to him and say, Lord, I believe, but help my unbelief. We can also pray and ask for things that we know that God can do, and we know that God might well want to do, but we also know that he might not want to do them, and he's wiser and better than we are. And so we yield our wills to his in all of our prayers, and rather than declaring and, in effect, constraining God to do something that we want him to do, We tell him our desires. We leave it in his hands. And then he, as our almighty and wise Father, responds in accordance with his will. The Holy Spirit enables us to pray within the will of God. This is the prayer of faith, is the prayer that God will do things for us because we've asked when they are compatible with his will, but he won't do things that aren't good for us if we ask for them. And that's a good thing too. Now, I was going to say, on this issue of prophecy, there's another interesting test that's occurred to me recently, and that is, a verse of the Old Testament that is often used by people in the NAR movement is from Amos 3, verse 7, where it says, "For the Lord does nothing without revealing his secret to his servants, the prophets." And this is used as evidence that God is continually offering revelation to the prophets because he's always busy about his business in the world. God is always doing things in the world, and prophets are always in the wings receiving revelation from God about what these secret things are that he reveals. And given that teaching, you have to ask yourself, why then, when there are times when prophecy would naturally be expected, given their assumptions, are they so quiet? And I think that we're living in this day, today, I mean literally today, March 8th, 2022, at a time when this is an interesting fact, that prophets are remarkably silent today about the likely outcome of the war in Ukraine. And yet everybody worldwide is watching this and wondering and thinking, where is God in this? And what is going to happen? And will they survive this onslaught from this other country? Will this, and if ever there was a time for a prophet to speak to the nations, now would certainly be an appropriate time. And after all, the Lord does nothing without revealing his secret to the servants, his prophets. Why so much silence? What is it about this virtual prophetic blackout that we're now experiencing? And I'll tell you what I think it is. I think it's because it's too recent that they have had such a difficult time getting things to come out the way they prophesied. With the Trump election, the vote results, with the trajectory of COVID, for example, there were predictions and prophecies made about how that would go, and they failed. And I think that right now, prophets, if you want to call them that, are fairly sensitive about being exposed when they get things wrong. And so it isn't surprising to me that they're so quiet in this day when you would otherwise really expect God to be busily getting the word out.
Really good and helpful.
That's profound. This question I concede on the onset is a bit speculative, but you guys have both studied this so much. And one of the things that Brian and I have kicked back and forth in discussion is I personally find atheism very interesting, and that's what I love to study arguments for and against the existence of God. And if I had a topic that, somebody said you can study what you'd like, I'd like to see like Christianity versus atheism, if you will. But one of the things that I began wondering as I started looking into this and listening to Brian and listening to my wife, who was actually saved in a New Apostolic Reformation church by God's grace, and thankfully was guided out of it by a good friend, is we began wondering, does skepticism create more atheists, or do things like NAR create more atheists, if you will? And so I guess what I'm trying to tease out here is, what kind of impact do you both think that this movement has on people kind of walking away from their faith?
We've definitely heard those stories, come across those accounts or of people who have completely walked away from their faith. What we hear maybe more often is people who had significant doubts about their faith. I think like even Brian, you may have been sharing that about some doubts you had about your faith after learning about, NAR and coming out of that. So that's a very common thing, to have doubts or just to be disillusioned with church and to drop out of church completely for a long time, not to feel like it's safe to go back to church, to be distrustful of all churches and reluctant to re-engage with the church. So I know that was a significant concern after the Olive incident, where this was in December 2019, right before COVID kind of came on everyone learned about COVID. Bethel Church was seeking to raise a little girl, a 2-year-old girl from the dead, the daughter of a worship leader who died unexpectedly. And so they were asking people worldwide to join in their prayers of declaration to raise this little girl from the dead. And they tried to do that for about 6 days. But the thing was, it was picked up by the national media that was following the story very closely. And so you had very many high-profile newspapers and online sources that were covering this. And there were a lot of concerns about what will happen, not just to the parents of Olive if she's not raised, but to all of Bethel's followers, and then to all the people worldwide and nationwide who were following these news stories. So the Friendly Atheist, if you're familiar with him, he has a huge following, yes, online following. He was following the story, and he was saying things, well, like, it takes nothing but religion could add more misery to something that's already a heartbreaking situation. And so he was disparaging all religion in general. And a lot of people on YouTube were going on and creating and mocking, for example, after COVID in particular, the prophecies that COVID would come to an end quickly, or that Trump would be reelected. Atheists were going on YouTube and creating these mocking videos, and there were just millions of views on these kind of things. So I think it definitely is a danger that people will abandon their faith and go to atheism, or at least become very disillusioned with their faith and Christianity in general, and just kind of walk away, at least for a time.
Yeah, I look at that case with Olive, and I have concerns at more than one level. I mean, it's just so gut-wrenching for a parent even to experience that, and then to experience the disappointment of this result. Expectation that she's going to be raised. They truly believed it. They were very faithful to that, and they could not have exercised more faith than they did, I'm sure. And yet, of course, it did not happen. And I have thought that that is one of the most egregious cases of pastoral malpractice I've ever known about during my lifetime. To raise the hopes of a parent that way, to give them that sense of conviction and confidence, and then it not happen. And then you just go on and do business as usual, and say, well, sometimes we get things wrong. How often can you get them wrong before people just simply won't believe you or trust you anymore, and they won't get their hopes up? And then the lesson is they lack faith. That's not the lesson. This was very poor leadership. And then, of course, it creates an opportunity for the outside world, the watching world, to mock and scoff and ridicule the powerlessness of that version of Christianity that is supposed to be the most obviously powerful and supernatural in its expression. You would think that the leaders themselves would be terribly embarrassed and remorseful and repentant in a situation like this, because even I am embarrassed by it, because I am a Christian, and I believe in God, and I believe that God can heal, but I don't believe in going about it that way. And so I don't like being put into a position where I have to defend what is truly supernatural about the faith, because people have abused the truths about this in this way. So it's problematic on a practical level in multiple ways for the people who are in it and experiencing it, for the people who are watching from the sidelines and hearing about it through the media, and then for Christians who distance themselves from NAR but still believe in the supernatural. And somehow, now we have to find a way to articulate that's profound, that's powerful, that's meaningful, that's filled with faith, but that is not superstitious or emotional or poorly grounded in the way that we've described.
Well, I think that's a good transition to one of the questions I just wanted to end on, and that is, from a pastoral perspective, I'm either in this sort of church or I've come out of this sort of church. Where do I begin to rebuild after such disillusionment that I've gone through?
Right. We give some advice in our books. One thing we often say is people need to learn to reread the Bible, or they need to learn to read it correctly, because these apostles and prophets have been modeling how to read the Bible incorrectly for so long that many people feel what they'll share with us is they had to learn to read the Bible correctly in context, using proper hermeneutics. So we think that's really key. We encourage them to get into a good church, and that's often one of the hardest things for people who talk to us, is because they're just so distrustful of all churches. But we do really encourage them that they need to get into a solid church where they can have fellowship with other believers to help them grow in their discernment, and encourage them. And maybe they'll even meet other believers in those churches who have experienced, who've come out of NAR or other destructive movements, who can help them walk alongside them. But if they haven't, there are online support groups, Facebook groups, for example, NAR recovery groups, where people come together who've come out of NAR and seek to encourage each other. And then also we encourage people to learn about spiritual abuse, to read books about spiritual abuse so they can learn to recognize the signs of spiritually abusive churches, and so they won't fall victim to that again, hopefully in the future. And that will make them feel safer re-engaging in a church again, if they know that they can spot the signs of spiritual abuse, and also that they can read the Bible correctly for themselves. So they'll be able to spot when it is being used incorrectly by the pastor in the pulpit.
I was thinking of a book that I read recently by a Christian apologist who was advocating for more of the miraculous as part of our apologetic. And I think there are serious problems with the author's thesis and with the evidence that he offers in support of it. But one of the things that he recommends is that people get out of the habit of just going to churches that are kind of on the dead side of things and not so expectant of the miraculous, and go and visit places where there is more expectation of the miraculous, where miracles are being reported and where people are talking about that we should be sharing with each other our miracle stories and so forth. And he means like literal miracle stories. And I take completely the opposite view of that. I think that that's a mistake. I think that what you need to do is look for other signs of revival in a church than the ones that we typically do. These are signs of personal transformation, of moral repair, of interpersonal, of love and relationship, where the virtues, the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, and patience, are all prominently featured in the lives of the saints. Their music may not be spectacular, right? Their socials may be a little hokey at times, but it may be that if you go and you root yourself in there, that's where you're going to experience the kind of transformation into the likeness of Christ that Jesus expected. The real gospel is a gospel of personal moral transformation and repair, and that's where where we should look for revival. And so when people leave a NAR-type church, sometimes they feel like they're leaving something that's more vital and more alive and more exciting. But I think that's because of the ways in which they've been trained to think about what to look for, when in fact what we should be looking for is vitality along these other lines of personal transformation and revival, both personally in dealing with sin, but also interpersonally and relationally with others and building a community. If you've got that, you don't need the other, really. You simply don't. And one of the things I do like to remind people is that God doesn't hold you, He doesn't look down on you if you have questions. If your faith is weak with respect to some of the miracle claims that you're hearing, He's not going to hold that against you. He's not going to withhold miracles from your life. Prayer is still at your disposal, and you can still ask Him in faith for the things that you need and that you desire, and then you can trust Him in His wisdom to provide as He sees fit. And that is really faith that's hard to translate into some passionate sort of mystical experience so much as it is just a kind of quiet confidence in God and waiting on Him to see how He will work, whether it's through miracles or not.
Well put.
Thank you so much for joining us for the interview, Holly and Doug. I'm going to link to both of your books in the show notes. Would you like to give us a little teaser on what you're working on for the future?
Sure. We've continued with this project. The book, A New Apostolic Reformation, with a big question mark on it, was published several years ago, and I hope that some of your listeners will look for that and pull out more of the detail of what we've been talking about for today. A companion volume written with less of an academic thrust is the book God's Super Apostles, Encountering the Worldwide Prophets and Apostles Movement. So those are two books that are already in print. But we have just finished the manuscript for a third book, and we expect that to be released sometime in the next few months. Then there's a fourth book that's nearly complete, and probably the timetable for that is about the same. So there's more to look for in this regard.
Super. We'll be looking forward to that, and definitely we'll point our listeners to it when those do come out. Holly and Doug, thank you so much for joining us. Wishing you all the best with the publication of the new book.
Thanks so much for having us on. This has been great.
Brian, Chad, thank you very much. Good to be with you.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If you have a question you'd like us to address or just a message for us, feedback, good or bad, you can either email us at podcast@apologetics315.com or leave a voice message for us using SpeakPipe. Just go to speakpipe.com/apologetics315 to leave us a message. And remember, if you include a Ghostbusters quote in your question, we guarantee that we'll read it on the podcast, and we also ensure up to 50% better quality answers. Also, if you've enjoyed today's podcast, please leave a review in iTunes or the podcast platform of your choice, and please share this episode with a friend if you found it useful. Remember, you can find lots of apologetics resources at apologetics315.com, along with show notes for today's episode. Find Chad's apologetic stuff over at Truthbomb Apologetics. That's truthbomb.blogspot.com. This has been Brian Auten and Chad Gross for the Apologetics 315 podcast, and thanks for listening.